Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and dare I say, good night. Whenever you're listening to this, welcome back to the Don't Panic, We're All Going to Die podcast. I'm your host, Johnny Nava, and today I sit down with documentary filmmaker and part-time carpenter, Sutton Raphael. Sutton is one of those guys that you like as soon as you meet him, and we actually talk about that here in this episode. His new venture is a comedy documentary series called Wormhole TV, and its focus is to bring attention to important environmental issues, as well as a few you've likely never even heard of. In this episode, we discuss first impressions, wood, the art of documentary filmmaking, as well as some tips for dealing with anxiety. What you heard at the beginning of the episode was the theme song for the show. I personally love it, so here it is again to lead us into the interview. All right, Sutton. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Really excited to have you. I've been looking forward to this conversation since we first started planning it, so happy that you're here.
I'm happy to be here, and I've got my coffee ready to go. I've got some water. I'm hydrated. I'm excited.
I love to hear. I woke up early just so I can get my second cup of coffee in before this conversation, so I'm glad you're on the same page. I thought a good place to start off would be for me to tell you my first impression of you.
That would be amazing. It's been a long time since I've heard someone's first impression of me, but I have to tell you, it's always something I've been fascinated by. Like I feel like I am a little bit obsessed with people's first impressions because it's important. You kind of need to, you need to come off, in my opinion, as like an open, warm person, and so I'm curious how I come off.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think first impressions are like extremely important because if you mess it up, you have a lot of ground to make up with people. That's the case. Just to give you peace of mind, mine was extremely positive. So I remember the first time I met you, I was at the beach, and it was like the first time I had been to the beach after the pandemic. So it was group volleyball. We had a huge group of people going. And I remember I was on the beach and I saw this guy with like this crazy looking surfboard. So I went up to you and I was like, dude, like what's up with the surfboard? It looks like it's something that you just chopped down a tree in your backyard and made. And you were like, yeah. And I was like, what? And you were like, no, that's exactly what happened. I chopped down this tree in my backyard and now it's here. And I was like, all right, well, can you surf on it? And you were like, I don't know.
That's what we're here to find.
Yeah. Right, that's why I'm here. And I was like, okay, well, like, where are you from? And you're like, well, I actually drove out here from New Mexico to try and surf on this surfboard because people on the internet told me to. And I was like, he has no idea how much I like him already. So that's my first impression of you. And since then, I've been watching the TikTok videos. I've been keeping up with the stuff that you're doing on YouTube. I think the editing specifically is fantastic. What was the path that led you to taking requests to doing random woodworking online?
I mean, you just hinted at it right there. You were like, he did it because people on the internet told him to. And I feel like there it is. It's a weird... desperate sense for validation online. I feel like I've kind of been trying to become friends or be liked by random people for a long time, and that is both not the most fun thing, but occasionally it leads to some pretty fun interactions. And so when I met you on the beach, that was kind of coming off of a very strange twist in my life that if you had told me that story a year ago, I would have said there's no way that could happen. But basically, when I ended up losing my job at NBC News about a year and a half ago, right at the beginning of the pandemic, I was at this crossroads where I figured, I didn't have much work in New York at all. I had been living there for 4 years. And I thought, it might be the right time to go spend some time with my family. They had just moved to New Mexico, and I had never spent much time in the state. And I found out pretty quickly that it's a little bit of a lonely place. There's not not a lot of things to do, not a lot of restaurants or bars. They live in a small farm that's up in the northern part of the state. And well, like, I had to find out how to entertain myself without, a lot of friends around. And so I started trying to make little things with my hands, whether that be a chess set or a pair of skis. I figured that if I just kind of kept myself busy making these items out of wood, then maybe I could start to just go down the rabbit hole. And it turned into a kind of a ridiculous TikTok series that that was pretty much entirely driven by ideas people submitted in the comments.
Right. So did you have any woodworking experience prior to doing this? Because I think the first thing that you made was like a chess set, if I'm not mistaken, and like that seemed like a pretty complex thing to tackle for your first time working with wood.
So I didn't. No, I had never taken wood shop in high school, but I did have an uncle who was a carpenter and an architect, and I guess it kind of runs in my family because my grandfather was a wood turner. He works on a lathe and makes beautiful bowls and candlesticks and you name it. He's made it. And so I kind of grew up watching him work with wood, and maybe like, subconsciously it was always there, and I always, liked working with my hands. But in this down period last year where, there just wasn't a lot going on, I kind of got to talk to my grandfather a lot. I got to talk to my uncle a little bit, and I guess just try it by failing, trial by fire, really. It was the chess set. I think to this day is the only really cool thing I made. Most of the others I think were glued together frantically, but the chess set I gotta say I'm still proud of.
Well, I have to say that I disagree that it's the only cool thing you made, because not only did you make Crocs out of wood, but you turned them into Heelys. What was the most difficult thing that you crafted out of wood? What gave you the most challenges?
You did mention the Crocs. The Crocs, it's almost embarrassing to talk about how long those took. That might have been like genuinely 15 straight hours of chiseling. I had a chisel and a block of elm log that I figured I could just start chiseling out the soles of these things. And always been a big Croc fan. I'm a big fan of shoes that are capable for any activity, sporty, hiking, water, you name it. They're perfect. So wood Crocs, not that they're necessarily original, because um, you know, clogs have been around for centuries, but but that was a fun challenge, and I gotta say I was proud of the gibbets I made, which, yeah, I didn't even know the Croc charms had a name, but gibbets apparently are pretty cool.
Well, they're certainly stylish, and I don't think that you need to, like, if you were ever to go out to a bar, I think the cool thing about wearing them is, like, you never have to worry about somebody wearing the same outfit as you if you have them. So it's definitely a positive.
Yeah, that's true. A lot of people did ask. They said they asked if I could mass produce them, and unfortunately, I just didn't have it in me. They were exclusively in a size 10, and didn't have a lot of customers after that. But a funny story. I used to we used to work in a WeWork building on this documentary team that I worked at in NBC News, and I kind of figured since it was a casual environment. It wasn't too professional. So I used to show up wearing tube socks and Crocs, fairly often, because I wanted to be comfortable at work. And eventually, my boss did pull me aside and say, "I got to tone down the athleisure wear. Got to step it up just a little bit." But the wood Crocs, those I think would have been fancy enough.
Yeah, it definitely would have been a fantastic icebreaker for any high level execs that you're looking to network with. I'm actually curious to hear a little bit more. Maybe we could take a couple of steps back. I'd love to learn kind of more about your history. Where you came from, what kind of led up to the job at NBC, and then what led to the departure from NBC.
Yeah. So I grew up in Portland. I grew up with a video camera in my hand all the time. I was kind of obsessed with making movies, and in middle school and high school, with friends. And I think at some point I realized that I loved documentary filmmaking because of how, it was just an excuse to go meet people all the time. It was kind of a tool that just opened up doors and allowed me into people's living rooms within minutes of meeting them and getting to ask really intimate questions that, I think traditionally we might stay away from asking. So I always loved that process. And at the University of Oregon, I ended up finding my home in the journalism school because they had these classes that kind of allowed you to go out into the field and really practice reporting. And they had a camera equipment room that you could rent cameras from on the weekends. And so it was a great community there to just start testing out these ideas. And really, I think just, making those early connections and friends that really wanted to collaborate on projects together. And so from there, I think I wasn't quite sure if a job, in documentary filmmaking existed. At the time, it's like there's not many staff jobs where you can join a team and just go out and film. And so I kind of figured I would move to New York and just see if I could meet people who were working at some of those news outlets like the New York Times and Vox and CNN, and I found a friend who needed a cat sitter, and so that gave me a free place to stay for a month, just to feed a cat twice a day. And it was just the perfect excuse to get to a big city for the first time and start to go get coffee with other video journalists and documentary filmmakers. And in that process, I learned of this brand new team that had launched at NBC News called NBC Left Field. And they were an international troupe of video journalists, which sounded too good to be true. It was such a dream job that I ended up just cold calling a couple people on the team and sending them some work and asking how I could possibly get started. And from there, it kind of just evolved into a freelance role and then a staff position of almost 3 years until they ended up shutting down the unit.
Right. And was the shutting down of the unit, was that pandemic related?
Ironically, it was just a month before the pandemic. They had decided that they just didn't have the funding to kind of keep producing digital documentaries on YouTube. I think they were at the time putting a lot more funding into covering the election and focusing on some broadcast films. And it was great, but it was a lot. It was kind of in that same era when Great Big Story ended, that CNN documentary group, and it was tough for video journalists in New York back then. So, at first I was like, oh, maybe this is an opportunity to go out on my own and try to start freelancing and trying some new projects and genres, and then the pandemic kind of shut down everything. So that was a tough moment.
Yeah, especially for, someone like in your shoes who is used to, going out into the field and going into people's living rooms, as you mentioned. The pandemic threw a wrench in all of that. What's interesting is like so much times in life, you're in a situation where like you are at NBC where, you're in a job that seems too good to be true. It aligns exactly with what you've always wanted to do, and it kind of feels like you're on cloud nine, and then something happens where it's out of your control completely, right? They shut down the team because of lack of funding. It has nothing to do with you or your skills, and yet it seems at times like failure in some ways, even though it's not really on you. I'm curious to hear how do you respond to those moments? Because from my perspective, it seems like it has given you, the opportunity to be more creative and pursue your interests in maybe a more different way, but it probably didn't feel like that at the time.
Yeah, you actually mentioned something funny right there that caught me off guard at first. This my first year working there, I had this kind of moment where I realized that I I had gotten this dream job a little bit too early. Like I was so excited to be doing this work and traveling to Japan and Mexico and across the United States to cover really, really amazing and compelling short documentaries, but I was like, uh-oh, I'm 23, 24, and I feel like if I have my dream job now, like what's next? I kind of knew that I would be ready or interested in trying something else eventually, but that was really the only thing that I had dreamt of up until that point. And so, I think when it ended, I was definitely a little bit lost. Like I liked the freedom of finally, thinking about, oh, maybe this is a good excuse to get into making music videos, or finally trying out a couple narrative short films. But, it was a moment where I didn't have a clear blueprint anymore. Like there just wasn't a map of what to do next. And I've kind of still been struggling just in the last year, over the pandemic. I think it just happened that there weren't a lot of work opportunities available, but I kind of think I would have gone through the same exact, you know, process of being a little bit lost whether or not there was a global pandemic. So right now I think I've finally started to find something that I am super passionate about and want to commit to for the next year. And it's kind of come in the form of a bit of a half documentary show, half comedy series that will hopefully explore environmental issues across the United States. And I've started this project Wormhole with my friend Eric, and we're really trying to reimagine how we learn about climate change and creating an educational series in the same vein as, Bill Nye the Science Guy, that is fun for people of all ages to watch and learn from, but combining it with, some of the comedy influences that I've always been inspired by, like Nathan For You, where, you can kind of help scientists come up with innovative ways to tell their groundbreaking research and share their groundbreaking research.
I do want to ask you about Wormhole TV. By the way, fantastic theme song. As soon as it came out, I was like, dude, they need to put this on Spotify. It's really catchy, and it just fits the vibe so well.
That is so funny. I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, no, it's great. I'd love to hear more about it, and kind of like what was the process of being like, hey, let's start this environmental TV show.
Yeah.
But one of the things that really struck me is when I was watching the first episode was just like how different people are, right? Because like when I was watching the first episode, I was like just blown away that like the people that you were working with, it was you went to a reservation in Idaho, I believe, to examine what was happening with the wolves there.
Mm-hmm.
I'll let you speak more to that. But what really struck me was the fact that you were hanging out with people that were like not too far from our age, and yet you have these guys who have like dedicated their entire lives to protecting wolves. And I think that's like a really cool thing to see, where it's just like you realize that like people have different sense of meaning in life, and like it's really cool to see how that manifests itself in other people.
Oh, that's so true. I'm glad you pointed that out, because it's kind of been my favorite part of this, journalism and documentary career, is just getting to meet people that are around my age who have completely devoted themselves to actually making like a real difference in this world. A lot of times I do kind of feel like a fraud because I get to go in and out of an issue and never truly commit to solving it, and that's hard to live with sometimes. But I do have to say, I genuinely love the learning process and getting to learn from each of these people about something that they have spent their whole life studying and passionately researching. That's a unique opportunity, but it's true. They're the people making an actual difference on a local level. And I've kind of met people like Logan and Nate, who were featured in that first episode, and Abaddon, who like they see this process all the way through. And I don't know, the more innovative ways I think we can bring their stories and their research to a whole new generation who has traditionally, I think, been turned off by climate change headlines and kind of not clicked past the headline. That's kind of what we're aiming at. So like when I was at NBC News, we do some climate stories, and I think I was always disappointed that they never broke through to my brother, my sister, my friends back home. Like, I would always have a good time learning about these stories. Like we did this story about seaweed that was being used to reduce methane emissions from cattle in California, and this species of red algae that can reduce these methane levels by 90% from the cow's burps. And I thought it was just fascinating. I had never taken like a biology class that was that cool before, but I was super disappointed to see, a story like that only get 7,000 views, whereas, a story I did about Japanese sex dolls got like 1 million, so it's tough to fight against some of those more kind of sexy issues or sexy stories, I guess. But at the same time, like I think we're trying to really reimagine in Wormhole how we tell those stories and what kind of how can we incorporate stuff that I've learned from TikTok this year and Instagram Reels into really making these stories as engaging as possible.
Well, I think you're doing a good job at that. Like, it felt like a very clean first pilot. I was engaged the whole time, so I think you're doing a good job. But I do want to go back to what you said about, you mentioned that you felt like a bit of a fraud because you're coming in and out of issues and can kind of, leave them where they stand. And I kind of wanted to challenge you on that a bit, because I think one of the cool things that you're doing is that, like, you may not be living in Idaho on like a campsite with a rifle, like making sure the wolves are protected, but you're using your talents as a documentary filmmaker to bring attention to these issues. And like someone, for me, I had no idea about wolves in Idaho, but now I do because, you made this episode about it and now I can learn about it. So the cool thing about being a documentary filmmaker is that you can go in and out of issues and kind of put a spotlight on something that's you feel like is important, and then in wolves, and then he could switch that to red algae, and all of a sudden I'm learning two things that I would have never learned about before. So
that's fair, and I appreciate you saying that. One of the things though that I've definitely tried to incorporate in my work over the last few years is, whenever possible, hiring a local producer to co-produce a story with me, because I do think there are certain insights that come from a community member that I will never kind of be able to emulate. So as long as, like, I don't know, as long as there's some attempt to be made to hire, someone to co-produce the story with you, I actually think no matter what, the story will be better. Like the access to certain subjects will always be more open. And so whether that's a story in our own country or an international story, it's something that I've definitely been kind of trying to move towards in the future.
That's a cool strategy. I never heard of anybody, specifically looking for local producers, but I think that's a cool way to do it. Is there anything that happened on your first episode that was like surprising to you? Because obviously, you're trying out something new and going out to Idaho and trying to start a new show. Like, I'm just kind of curious, like, what was that like for you to kind of get this thing off the ground? And did anything interesting happen while you were out there that you were just kind of surprised by and maybe stuck with you a little bit?
There were some moments that definitely surprised both Eric and I. Eric is actually from Boise. He grew up in Boise and lives there now. So that was kind of a cool first story for him as well, to get out into central Idaho and the mountains close to his house and kind of talk to some people that he had never met before. But we were out there, and I'll try not to give too much away, but we were out there, and these two guides that we were with were some of the best howlers that I've ever heard. They could mimic the howl of a wolf that I didn't even know was possible. And they tried to teach me, and my attempt was pretty sad. But I will say, they were asking us after our day of hiking if we wanted to get up at 4 a.m. to go do this howling survey to try to call wolves in and see if we could get any responses. And we were like, oh, that sounds great. Like, maybe 6 a.m. They were like, yeah, let's do 6. Let's sleep in a little bit. We wake up at 3:45 and we hear actual howling. We're like, holy smokes. We're looking around. Eric shakes me awake, and we're in our sleeping bags outside. And we kind of can't believe it, because we'd been hoping to hear wolves, or at least get some sense that wolves were in the area for like the last 48 hours. And here they were, like, waking us up in the middle of the night. And we like get up, and we're really excited, and we go try to find Nate, who was one of the howlers that was with us. And we find out that he is nowhere to be found. His sleeping bag is empty, and he had gone out alone to try to call wolves in. and that was disappointing to find out that it was actually him all along. So this trip we didn't end up doing wolves, but in the future it gives us a reason to go back and give it a shot.
Well, that's cool. I mean, I suppose, that in some ways that's a good thing, right? If like the whole point is that trying to keep them, away from humans, perhaps it's a good thing that you didn't see them, but
exactly.
But maybe next time. One of the things that I just find so fascinating is people's unique approach to the creative process. It's just something that I personally am just absolutely fascinated by. And when I'm reading about writers and kind of how they set the mood for themselves, there's no two that are in common. Some wake up at 6 a.m. and start writing 2 hours a day at a certain time. Other people will be like, I can only write at night. Some people, I forgot the name of the author, but she would walk out to a tree. Every time she needed an idea, she'd take a long walk out to a tree and come back. And I'm curious to hear if there's anything unique about yours that you do that you're like, I feel like I might be the only person that does this.
That's a great question. I'm kind of obsessed with the creative process too. I love reading about other people's strategies. But for me, I think I'm naturally an extrovert, but I feel like in order to get anything done and have any creativity at all, I kind of have to be alone in that like kind of process of both thinking of topics and stories, but also even editing. And so, sometimes I'll accidentally kind of wall myself off for a week at a time and kind of forget to respond to any text messages, any emails, any phone calls, and kind of just become a hermit to get certain progress made on some of these projects. And it's tough because like after a couple days like that, I always feel kind of more depressed and more anxious, and it's true that like I've gotten stuff done, but it doesn't put me in the best headspace, and so it's a constant kind of push and pull trying to figure out the right balance of whether or not to be social and happy or alone and productive. So that's something I'm still really trying to figure out. But when I do need a little bit of help kind of getting back into a good space, running really helps me. I've kind of taken up running in the last couple of years, and it's kind of another one of those solo activities that just helps my mind work itself out from certain kinks, and if that makes sense.
No, that makes sense. That makes complete sense. So yours is more like when you feel like you need to get stuff done, it's like you need to just completely isolate yourself and just dedicate the time to the work.
Yeah, but you know what I mean when it's like in doing that, a lot of times it kind of just puts you in a slightly darker place. Like I don't know. I've always I struggle with that for sure because I really feel happiest when I'm in a big group and going to play volleyball on the beach, like the moment that I met you, and yet sometimes in those moments, I had this summer was kind of a great example of this, of like I had so much fun getting to reconnect with a lot of old friends from high school and family that I hadn't seen for the last 2 years, but it was also kind of the least productive in terms of work and creativity that I've been trying to figure out how to grapple with that. But there weren't a lot of TikToks produced this summer because I was too busy getting to see all my old friends.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that. I was listening to a podcast with one of my favorite writers, and he mentioned it's like almost like a triangle. There's work, there's the scene, which is like going out and like having a good time, and then there's like your family on the other side of the triangle, and it's like you can only pick two. And so I've found that to be extremely true, like with my own stuff, because like so I'm doing this podcast, which takes a lot of time, and then I'm also like trying to write a book that kind of coincides with it. So it's like oftentimes I find it where it's like you can only really pick two things ever. If you're going to be going around in the scene, going to volleyball, whatever it is that you like to do, going to bars, hanging out with friends, then it's like you're going to sacrifice that time spent with family, or in our case, maybe like the people that you're really close with, or you're sacrificing the time that you would be doing the actual work. So I often find like, for me, like when I'm choosing to work and like have those times like you where you're isolating yourself and like working a lot, then it's like it's always coincides with like you're missing out on something else. Totally. So I feel like the creative path is very much one of sacrifice. Like you're gonna have to sacrifice something to get where you want to go.
How often do you like talk to family on the phone? Do you ever feel guilty of just kind of putting those relationships by the wayside when you're trying to get something done? Or
I definitely feel like, my parents would call me more than I call them. My parents are based in the Bay Area. We're both based in LA. So it takes a bit of time to like go back, and you really have to kind of plan ahead to visit them, at least for me. But what I struggle with is like I write a lot. My job takes up a lot of my time during the week. So I tend to write a lot during the weekend. So I'll write on Saturdays and Sundays. And as my grandparents are kind of getting older, for me, it's like I really would like to spend more time with them. And oftentimes I feel like the times that I may be making a trip out, I've sacrificed to like stay inside and do some writing. And so that's kind of where my guilt comes from. But one thing that I thought was really interesting that you said was, isolating yourself gets you in kind of a depressive state. I think that's interesting because I think that's where oftentimes like a lot of the art comes from, is like those really volatile emotions.
Just to take it full circle, last year, coming off of this tough year, I just kind of had to confront these problems head on and realize that I wasn't comfortable being alone. I was just not comfortable at all being in my own space with my own thoughts, with no other distractions. And so it took months to finally get to a place where I was starting to like be able to be more present and realize that I wasn't missing out on all of these other things happening. I kind of had to just focus on my own routine during the day that sometimes only involved going for a jog and cooking lunch. Like there wasn't a lot going on for the first time in my whole life. And it was really difficult at first, but out of that, I think came this desire to learn new things again and try to experiment with the creative process like I hadn't done for years. Kind of coming off of the job at NBC, I was a little bit burned out and not sure if I really wanted to continue filmmaking and working with cameras. And I think I kind of went through this weird birthing process where I started from the beginning again and basically just started using my phone in the backyard as a camera and realizing that like at its core, the tools don't matter at all. It's simply, is there an idea? Is there a small little narrative arc here? And, in that process, I realized that if I just started filming myself working on these chess pieces, maybe that's compelling to watch, maybe not, but it's worth a shot. And it was such a unique realization that it kind of brought back my joy again in terms of, oh, this is so fun. I wonder how I can kind of create a transition or where could this series go from here? And it's definitely kind of evolved my thinking in terms of like, oh, okay, the video projects that I work on don't always have to be serious. They don't all have to be shot with a 4K camera. And in doing so, I feel like I can actually be more comfortable with allowing my personality in them. And that's something that I hadn't done much of in the past.
Right. It's interesting. I'm not sure if I imagined it, but I'm pretty sure you compared it to like almost like a rebirth in terms of like going to New Mexico and like really trying to sort like yourself out and trying to figure out, how am I going to come out of this? And it's interesting because I feel like oftentimes like the solution to our problems often seems like this enormous change, right? Where it's like, you're like, okay, I'm having all these issues. Maybe I need to like break up with my girlfriend, or maybe I need to like relocate to somewhere new. But it's like, wherever you go, that's where you are. And so it's like, sometimes I think that's like a very necessary step that people need to take, where it's just like, you get to a situation where you don't really know, you're feeling a little bit lost, and then you kind of like figure it out, and you try to emerge with it with some type of new, you have that rebirth where it's like you emerge from it being like, hey, I've spent some time thinking, and now I'm comfortable with myself being in front of the camera. These are the talents that I assess that I have, and now I'm going to try and do something different with it. I definitely relate to that a lot.
Yeah.
I think that was
wherever you go, that's where you are. Is that a saying? I've never heard that before, but it's pretty good.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's a saying. I'm confident that I didn't make it up, but I wish that I had.
I don't know. Own it if you did, because that hit. That hit right there. I was like, oh, okay.
Well, maybe I'll look into trademarking it after this, after our conversation. But yeah, it's definitely something that I relate to. So, kind of where you came from that, and I think that the pandemic was that for a lot of people.
Yeah.
It really forced a lot of people to slow down, and I think that a lot of people are still struggling with it in a lot of ways because they haven't had that emergence from it where they've really figured out what they need to do. I think a lot of times, for a lot of people, it was very isolating and lonely. Past couple
it was,
years.
it was funny. It was like, it was coming off of such a high in my life, actually, just like that fall of sorry, what was that? That was like fall of 2019. I had it was kind of as NBC was winding down, and I did this dream project where I shot a music video for one of my like childhood icons, Damian Lillard. Like being from Portland.
Dalla Dame.
Dame Dalla, right? Like it was such like a high in my life, and I was like, damn, this is great. We shot it with this beautiful camera. It was a big production, tons of people on set, and it came out so cool. And after that, kind of another one of those moments where you kind of check something off of a bucket list, and instead of feeling like satisfied and content, it actually leaves you with a bit of a hole in your stomach of like, oh, like where do I go from here? Like that was a big goal of mine, but I didn't really have another goal in place already to fill its spot. So coming off of that, just trying the creative process from the beginning again, just starting over and realizing that with something as simple as a smartphone, cool, fun videos can actually still be made.
Right. And that's cool that you worked with Dame. I think one of the most visceral reactions I ever had to a sport was when he shot that 3 over Paul George.
Yeah,
to knock I think
it's
the
a
Clippers.
moment that will go down as like one of the most exciting things I've ever witnessed in my entire life. Not in person, but over the TV. It was just incredible.
Ice cold, just like stone faced too right afterwards. One of the coolest things I've ever seen. But in talking about that, I think you touched on something which is like you hear it all the time with celebrities too, where it's like you have this goal of like, if I accomplish A, then I'll be happy. Or like it's like this bucket list thing. You're like, if I can just do these things, then I know that these are the goals that I have, and that's what's going to bring me like the ultimate satisfaction in life. But then it's like you do them and you realize that it doesn't do what you wanted it to, and then you're kind of like lost all over again. So what was that like for you? Because I think that I that's something I absolutely relate to myself, and I'm kind of curious to hear like what's your perspective on that, your reaction to it, and like how do you deal with those emotions?
I when it comes to emotions, I still haven't learned how to deal with them. I try to remind myself like what is fun. What part of the project was the most fun, and at the end of the day, that's usually the production side for me. Like we put all this emphasis and excitement on the moment the project drops, or the response from the public, or whether or not it got a million views online. And I think I always have to keep reminding myself that I have the most fun producing and being, in the field with a camera with just one or two other people, and that process for me, I just need to keep reminding myself that that's why I do it. That's what's fun, and whether or not something got, one comment or 100 comments, it's all kind of that's what it has to boil down to.
What I've realized in kind of doing these things is like the idea of happiness is like, at least the American idea of happiness is like very flawed, where it's like, I think we've been taught in some way, or at least we have some type of expectation of like, once we reach a certain amount, like peak, then that's where we need to go, and then happiness will be achieved. But then there's like, the thing is, there's always another peak to reach. So I think to touch on what you kind of mentioned yourself, for me, it's been like trying to like fall in love with the actual process of doing things, where it's like, you know, I think a lot of times we're obsessed with like the finished product, and it's like the actual process is like, if you can find a way to like find joy in that, that's like the ultimate happiness, at least for me. Are you familiar with like the flow state?
Actually, no.
So this guy, Will Schroeder, he does like these YouTube videos that I really enjoy, and he does a series on like the idea of happiness. But he talks about the flow state, and it's like you're performing at the peak of your talent at the thing that you love. You're like in a flow state. So you see it with like musicians all the time. Like you see someone like ripping a guitar solo, and like you can see on their face, it's like they're in it. Like they have no control what they're doing. They're just like totally, that's like the flow state for musicians. I think that you can get into that as an editor. I'd certainly feel that at times as a writer when I make a sentence that I'm like, wow, I don't even feel like that came from me. That was like almost beyond my ability to write that. And I feel like trying to like achieve that, and then like when I'm in it, just being like, oh, this is like happiness for me. This is what I meant to do. That's something that I've like learned.
It, I don't know why, but it kind of reminds me of something. I just spent Thanksgiving with my family, and something that my cousin actually brought up at Thanksgiving was that she was grateful that she was taught to love to learn, which sounds like kind of such a simple sentence and simple idea, but it kind of resonated with me in terms of that's at the end of the day what I think both you and I kind of through this kind of creative process we kind of have to remind ourselves that we're doing this because we love to learn new things, whether that be from an expert or a technique, when it comes to editing. It's just that process of learning that's got to keep us going.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's like having like that curious brain about like whatever you do. That's like what ultimately leads you to be like improving at whatever it is that you're interested in. But not only just like whatever you're interested in, just like if you can take that approach to any obstacle that you have in life, I think it's like a fantastic approach. And what an insightful thing to be thankful for Thanksgiving. I think it's a really cool thing to say.
Yeah, no, I gotta say, whenever I read pieces that are written by my little cousins and my sister and my brother too, like I always feel insecure because they're all such good writers, and I've never never had confidence in my own writing, and I think that's why I used to cheat in class and just turn in videos instead of essays. But I love getting to read their writing because it always leaves me with strange insights that I hadn't thought of before.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's what I love about writing. It's like I love all art, but I think one of the cool things about writing is like, to me, it's like the only thing that really lets you like crawl inside someone else's brain for a little bit. It's like you can think how someone else thinks, and like that's like such like a rare thing, because
totally,
you have like, it feels like you have like this entire universe inside of you at all times. The only means we have to communicate that is through words, and I feel like it can be really difficult to do that verbally. But then if you have some time to like sit quietly in a room and put your thoughts on paper, a lot of times you can emerge with something that's like, hey, this is exactly how I feel about certain things, and that's really cool. It's a really cool process.
Are you writing fiction or nonfiction?
So I started off writing fiction. So like when I was like 18, I started off like, it was like I felt like I was kind of at like the beginning of the internet in a lot of ways, where like when the internet emerged, there was like for kids and teenagers, it was like, who's the best guitar player? And then like there was like creepy horror stories that were like on the internet that were kind of like passed around. And like I was like, I want to try my hand at writing. It seems like the only thing people are interested in is horror, so I started writing horror stories.
Oh wow.
And it like got me on like a few podcasts that were kind of emerging when podcasts were starting to emerge. And so like I've been able to kind of pivot that into like, I've gotten paid to do that, ghostwriting, and then also just like writing for different podcasts and different places on the internet. But I'm kind of switching my thing to nonfiction, because I think the insights that I emerged from the pandemic with is it was like, in the same way that you're using your talents to like put a spotlight on environmental issues, I kind of went through some mental health issues, in my early 20s, and I was like, I really would like to help other people kind of navigate through theirs. And the only skill that I really feel like I have that is like a talent is writing. And so I'm trying to write nonfiction based on like, hey, here's some things that really helped me and they might help you. So I'm going to put them on paper just in case they do.
That's amazing.
But that's actually a good segue into mental health, because that's kind of what the reason I started this podcast is to kind of like, put a spotlight on some of these things. And you mentioned, getting to a place where you feel anxious and depressed at times. I'm curious if you have anything that helps you overcome those times in life that are a little bit more difficult.
Some of my own tricks.
Yeah, like a tip.
You know that moment when you kind of look at your parents in a new way, like they've been trying desperately to give you little keys and pieces of wisdom throughout your whole life, and you've always kind of said, no way, like I don't need to drink water today, like I don't need to go for a walk. But there was this moment when my dad used to try desperately to kind of help me feel better, like if I was having a bad day or something like that. And then one day I finally realized, like, oh damn, his little pocket of tricks was extremely useful. He said, he used to say, number one, if you're feeling bad, you probably haven't had enough water to drink. And I still live by that today. Whether it's a mental placebo or really just body health, I have definitely started to pay attention to my own hydration. But I do think like body, mind, like they're so connected. So when your body's feeling good from exercise or yoga or whatever, it usually plays such a direct role into my own mental health.
Yeah, sure. But going back to what you were saying about like you were surprised to learn how much more wisdom your dad had been trying to give you than you initially kind of took it for. One of my favorite quotes by Mark Twain. To be honest, I've never read one of his books, but like I love his quotes. And he said,
he's got great quotes.
He's got amazing quotes. And he said, when I was a boy, my father was so ignorant that I could hardly stand to have the old man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much the old man had learned in 7 years.
That's it, right? That's it exactly. It's all of a sudden like you realize that your parents are real people and actually, smart in a way. I still remember as a kid, I used to think my mom had terrible taste in music. And then one day I realized that she was the very first person who like ever played me Bon Iver, like back in like 2006 or something. And I was like, what? Like, Mom, you were on it back then. Like you were ahead of the curve. And to this day, like I think she's got great taste in music. So it's things like that are fun to realize.
Yeah. And as you become an adult, you're like, you could kind of see that, not your parents, I wouldn't say like it's equals almost, but you kind of see them as like humans instead of parents. And that's a really cool kind of like stage in the relationship to get to. And then you could kind of appreciate the things about your parents, like listening to Bon Iver. My dad listened to like the Temptations and like Smokey Robinson and like all these like really like Motown artists. And like when I was a kid, I was like, man, these guys suck. Like, but like now that I'm older, I'm like, those songs slap. Like I still listen to them all the time.
That's it. Yeah. How did they have such great taste? The wisdom. How did they become so wise? I don't understand.
Yeah, I don't either. But I think it's just experience.
What are some of the tricks that you have kind of discovered through this podcast? Like, I'm curious. Like, what are certain like I guess think of it as a toolbox. Like, what are some tools that other people have talked about?
Sure. Well, I haven't done a ton of interviews yet, but I can tell you some things that I do that are like I find to be extremely helpful.
That would be amazing.
So one of the things that I like to do is just like I struggled with anxiety and depression. That was like kind of my thing. But I feel like I've kind of overcame them in a lot of ways. Some of the things that I like to do though is like just like focusing on gratitude, because it's like I've tried as much as I can to like eliminate envy for my life. So going back to the gratitude thing, it's like if I ever like am like upset about like a situation, I try and just like recalibrate immediately. So it's like something might happen at work, and like I could be grateful for the same thing every day, or it could be something different, but it's usually like, hey, like this thing's really frustrating for me now, but in the big scheme of things, how big of a deal is it? Like I'm healthy, you know, I have access to all my limbs, I have great people around me. And so like, you know, a lot of things that we get frustrated about and that really like cause us grief or anger, they're like really not that big of a deal. So like focusing on gratitude is one thing. And then like for me, I discovered Stoicism a few years back, which has been like a huge help for me. To sum it up, it's basically like a practical philosophy that's based on, rather than reacting to things, you just try to control things that you can't control. You just try to control your reaction to those things. And so like I found it to be really helpful for me because like so much of my anxiety came from like focusing on things that were beyond my control, and or being like, this thing happened and I wish that it didn't happen this way. But you know, focusing on like, okay, well, I can't change that. So what can I do moving forward, or how can I control my reaction to this situation has been really helpful for me because it allows me to discard so many unnecessary thoughts.
That's interesting, kind of planning for the future and kind of taking those mental notes to prevent it in the future. That's cool.
Yeah.
One thing that I am always a little bit, I guess, like thinking about is narcissism and like I really when I have an idea, it's kind of the only thing that consumes me, and I've definitely been like realized that I haven't been the best at gratitude in the past, like expressing gratitude for friends and family, and that's something I definitely want to get better at. And I kind of feel like that might solve some anxiety too down the road.
Mm-hmm. And also like going back to like the narcissism, like I'll be honest, like I was like a straight up narcissist in my early 20s in a lot of ways. And
it's hard not to be.
Yeah, because you're just so focused on yourself. I think it kind of breeds a lot of unhealthy qualities. But like another thing that I find to be really useful is like, so a lot of my unhappiness was like being like, okay, well, I'm here, but I wish I was where this other person was, and like just being jealous and envious of other people. And I found that like if I can like talk myself into being a fan of everybody, then like that's like been like a huge help to me. Like I like making movies and stuff. You like making movies and stuff. Like, why not just be happy for you that you're doing well at that thing, rather than being like, I wish that I was doing that thing. It's like, just because you're doing well doesn't mean that like I'm doing bad. It's like you can just be happy for people that are happy doing what they do. I heard something the other day. It was like, envy is the only sin that isn't fun. Because it's like it only causes yourself damage, and you know.
Yeah.
But I know we're coming up on time here. I have one final question for you, and it's a bit cliche, but what is one piece of advice that you would give to a younger version of yourself?
Something that I used to admire about myself that I actually don't have anymore, that I would tell that person to just hold on to, is this little sense of like false confidence. Like there's really no better saying than fake it till you make it. I think I used to think that like, oh, you know, this thing that I worked on was really cool, and it you know it should open doors, right? And I don't necessarily have that same self-confidence anymore. But back when I was in high school and school, like I used to absolutely have so much love for various projects that I worked on, and it was like, hey, yeah, this could get me in the door here, and you know, sending out some of those early emails and sliding into people's DMs of like, yeah, like I'd love to work with you. Clearly, like we're not on the same level, but I think I used to do that because I was convinced that we could be. You know, like I'd love to work with you down the road. Like I'd love to hear how you first got started. Like that sense of admiration and like hunger to just learn from people who are way, you know, doing amazing stuff. I want to kind of hold on to that. Where now I'm like, oh, I don't know if I you know should be in that room. You know, I don't think I'm ready for that job quite yet. And I want to kind of get back to that healthy place of like I want to try that. I want to do it even though I don't necessarily know how. You know.
Right. That's a great answer. So fake it till you make it, but like in a way that you're seeing yourself as like for your own potential rather than like maybe for what you are at that moment. I like that.
Yeah, that's a really articulate way of saying what I just blabbered.
All right, well, Sutton, this has been so much fun. I really appreciate you being on the podcast. What have you got going on in your life? How can listeners find you online if they want to see more from you? Yeah, plug yourself.
Well, I really am so excited about this latest series that I've started with Eric called Wormhole, and you can find it at gowormhole.com or check it out on YouTube. We're really just getting started, but we've got a couple really exciting episodes on the way. You mentioned our theme song. We have a new hit single that will be coming out in an episode in the next couple of weeks that I think you'll really love. And well, here's a sneak preview. It's from the perspective of both Fahrenheit and Celsius, and they realize they've got to work together to solve climate change. So keep an eye out for that on your local radio station, because it's going to be the hottest song of 2022.
I love that. I'm looking forward to it. Son, I really appreciate you stopping by, and I can't wait to see what else you put out in the world, because I've loved everything you put out so far.
Well, thank you so much, Johnny. This has been such a treat for me too, and I can't wait to keep in touch. You close, not close enough. I want you and I'm needing your affection, baby. I wanna know what you're thinking of. It's hard to tell standing at a distance. And that's a wrap for this week's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation with Sutton, then there's a high chance you'll enjoy Wormhole TV. At the time of this recording, I believe there are 2 episodes out, and they're both engaging in a way that most YouTube series aren't, so I highly recommend giving it a watch. And on this podcast, all of the music you've heard so far comes from one of my favorite bands, Karate Baseball. In the next episode, I actually sit down with one of the founders, Ben Hecht, to discuss monetizing creative skills, the songwriting process, and the impact of violence on society today. It's also an experimental episode, so if you want to know what I mean by that, you'll have to give it a listen. But until then, my name is Johnny Nava. If you want to keep up with the podcast, please consider following me on Instagram if you don't already. It's where I release news about the podcast, so if you want to stay in the loop, feel free to get in touch with me there. It's Here's Johnny Nava. And until next time, I hope you have a beautiful life, and I hope to have you back for future podcasts. Take care.